The Finance Committee meeting for February the 1st to order. And as we discussed at last council meeting, it's been some years since we put the debt policy and financial policy for the city under a microscope. And I know that I sent out a bunch of questions to Mr. Schroyer, which he expeditiously responded back to, which I certainly appreciate. And I believe all the members of council were copied on that one as well. So since you've seen those things, we'll go through a few additional questions and clarifications, but I know that administration and Mr. Schroyer in particular has had the opportunity to review this, and I do want to give him the opportunity to expand on any of his questions or comments from my questions, and also to give he and the administration an opportunity to review any items that they think might need to be modified in the policy before we go into any other questions or comments from members of council. So, Mayor, Mr. Schroyer, if you could kind of give your thought process of things that you'd like to have modified. I know one of them you mentioned in the write-up, responding back to my questions. But go ahead and kind of walk through the items that you see that might need to be modified.
Thank you, Mr. Fry. Can everybody hear me? A little bit of history on this policy. It was created back in August of 2006 with the help of our bond financial advisor. The intent being to create this policy to improve our bond rating, which it has done. It was a requirement of improving our bond rating. So that's where this all got started back in 2006. There's been minor modifications both in 2010 and in 2016. Nothing major, just some minor, kind of just taking care of some of the things that needed to be updated, smaller things. And so here we are now in 2021. And looking through the policy, again, there's a couple minor changes that administration is going to be recommending. If everyone has the policy in front of them, on page 6, section B2, it talks about the eligibility for funding capital projects, and it includes a minimum of $50,000. We have always used, contrary to the policy, we've always used $10,000 as the threshold. I think the example I gave Mr. Fry is if we purchased a vehicle for $15,000, we took it out of the capital improvement fund, whereas this policy is saying currently that it has to be at least $50,000. So my recommendation would be to change that $50,000 to $10,000. That's also the threshold that we used to include it as a fixed asset and depreciate it, the $10,000 limit. And then if you go to page 8, section V, E as in Eric, this talks specifically about the information technology department being an internal service fund. A few years back, we had changed that to include it into the general fund, the operation fund, just like the police department or the finance department or the court. It made more sense just to include it in the general fund, and so that's what we did. So that whole section, that talks about the information technology fund would just be deleted. And then if you would go back to page 6, Roman numeral 4A, that's where we talk about where our income tax receipts get distributed between the general fund, the capital fund, and the income tax fund. This is something that we changed in 2016. prior to 2016, the policy read 1/6 of the income taxes went to the general fund, 1/6 went to the capital fund, and 4/6 went to the income tax fund. Basically, that equates to 16.5, 16.5, and 67. So we changed it to actual numbers, and we changed it so that more was going to the general fund versus the capital improvement fund, because we were no longer making those transfers per the auditors from the capital improvement fund to the general fund. It's my belief that if the income tax revenues come in this year where we have budgeted them and we were conservative, that we will be able to change that percentage. I don't know how much it'll be yet, but we'll be able to lower the general fund percentage and increase the capital fund percentage. Right now, the budget shows a surplus, basically a $1.3 million being transferred from the general fund to the capital fund. If we change these allocations, then we will no longer have to do that transfer. It'll just be whatever goes into the general fund stays there, whatever goes in the capital fund stays there. But it'd be my recommendation to wait till after tax season to make sure that the numbers are coming in where we want them to come in and where we budgeted them to come in. So as a whole, it makes sense to me to wait to do the other changes and do them all at once and make one change to the document. The two previous changes I talked about aren't anything that are going to affect us between now and tax season or anything like that. We could change it now and then change it again after tax season if we're able to. It'd just be my recommendation to just do it all at once.
Why do we want to put more money into the capital fund?
To support the projects that we're doing. That's essentially, we need more money in there to do the annual projects that we've been budgeting. That's the one fund that's kind of been as a deficit spending because our projects has been a little higher than what the income tax money going into it. And if we just leave it in the general fund's just going to keep building up and be a lot higher than what we really need it to be, or really what it should be, as long as we keep controlling our expenses.
Now, the problem is the capital fund, as was originally set up, was not supposed to be sacrosanct for capital expenditures. That was never its original intent. And the auditor stepped in and unilaterally changed that. And when you go back and you look at the language that was used when we established a capital fund, we had a lot more flexibility in spending from that capital fund than we do now. I mean, there's really no problem making these transfers. It simply allows us to, and doesn't it allow us more flexibility in how we spend our general fund dollars?
Are you asking a question if we don't increase the percentage
right
in the capital fund? Certainly, the general fund is going to always have a pretty big, like this year, it's a $1.3 million surplus. But at the same time,
but we know we have capital obligations, mm-hmm. and it's really more a financial management issue than, and with this interpretation that the auditors come up with, the money in the general fund, I mean, unless we want to limit ourselves, I mean, this hasn't been a council that has neglected our capital obligations, I don't think. And so as a council, we've been willing to transfer those monies to do those capital projects. I'm just, I'm loath to give up the flexibility, in a rainy day situation. We didn't have we came through this COVID thing in great shape. Mm-hmm. But, if we had half the revenue, we would have wanted to, or if we had lost, if we had lost a significant amount of revenue as a result of the pandemic, if the money was in the capital fund, under the auditor's gig, we couldn't spend it to pay police and to pay our staff. But under, when it's in the general fund, we can spend it there and we can transfer what we need into the capital fund.
And to your point, Doug, if there had not been any support through the funding, not the PPP funds for the city, essentially, we may have found ourselves in a different situation this year.
Toby, a couple clarifications on this. Just immediately above that section you were talking about, it talks about there's 8% municipal income tax collections net of costs going into the capital improvement fund. Is that really repetitive with what the income tax is below, or is that in addition to?
It's repetitive.
Okay.
There's a total of 8% going into the capital.
Okay. And I also generally recall that the 67% that goes into the income tax fund, we pay debt service, we pay the overhead for the income tax department, and the rest is then split again. Could you refresh my memory on what that split is? I know most of it goes to the general fund, but for some reason I'm thinking some goes to capital as well.
No. Once you are correct in everything you said, but once we get to after we pay the expenses of the income tax department and transfer to the debt service fund to pay off our bonds, the rest goes to the general fund. None of that goes to the capital improvement fund.
Okay, so all of it goes to general after we cover those, obviously our debt obligations.
Yeah. And the reason that I would be suggesting changing the allocation is right now we got about $1 million going into the capital improvement fund, and we're regularly spending close to $2 million in projects. But I see what you're saying, Doug, and I'm open to it. It makes no difference accounting wise how we do it. Just know that if we leave it the same, that general fund balance is going to build up pretty fast because our income tax receipts are outpacing our increases in expenditures. And it was 16.5 before, so it just made sense to me to try to get it closer to back to the way it was. But I'm open to leaving it alone also.
This is a labor negotiation year, and I think I lean towards what Toby's recommending for this year simply because we're going into labor negotiations, and I don't like the general fund to look healthier than it should. If we're really going to be spending the money on capital, that's where we should put it. It's putting it more back the way it's traditionally.
I think the mayor's frozen.
Mayor, we lost you.
He's back, I think.
Yeah.
Did you hear what I said?
Yeah, about the labor negotiations.
Yeah, labor negotiations are coming up.
Right.
We can certainly, we've got a budget. We know what we're going to be spending. We can do that transfer tomorrow.
Well, and we budgeted the 1.3 to transfer this year. That's in the 2021 budget, correct?
That is correct.
So this would be a forward-looking decision that we would potentially consider, correct? For 2000,
it would make sense to me to start it at the beginning of a year. Yeah.
If we did, so we would be looking to start it in 22 in your mind?
The very beginning of it, yes.
I also recall that, according to later on in the policy, if I recall correctly, that we're shooting for about 40% of the general fund's annual requirements to be the balance. What is that approximately? What is that number, and how does that compare to the current numbers?
Got that right here. Just let me scroll through this. All right, our general fund expenditures, and it's after we take that 1.3 million transfer out. It does not include the transfer. It's 12.4 million. So 30%, the general fund should be 30% of that, or 3.7 million. The water fund is 20% of the water fund expenditures, which is 6 million. So the water fund should be 1.2 million. But remember, that's close to 6 million because we built that up if we went to our own water system or different options there. That's why that is so high. As far as sewer, 30%, and their budget is 4.6 million. So the 30%, their balance should be 1.4 million. It's about a $500,000 right now, but we have that increase that we just put into place. It's going to take care of that. And then capital improvement, 100% of the general fund. So the general fund expenditure is 12.4, and our actual capital balance is 15 million.
Right, and we do know that we've got some very significant future obligations with the bridge deck coming.
3 million, yeah.
Okay. Understand your thought. So effectively, all the funds are about where they're supposed to be, or shortly will be, based or better than what was in the plan later on, I don't know, 3 or 4 pages later, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Any other questions or comments from members of council on Mr. Schroyer's recommendations?
It would be my suggestion to have another, unless you guys want to make those 2 minor changes now, be my recommendation to have another finance committee meeting after the income tax season and be able to talk about this more and decide where we want to go, especially with the allocation percentages.
Yeah, personally, that makes more sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not a decision we need to make today. I think that makes sense. Any other comments from other members of council in that regard? Just to wait until we see what the numbers look like come after the income tax season goes by? Okay. So in addition to that, I did have a couple of follow-up questions from the responses that Mr. Schroyer gave to me. Are there any other questions from other members of council before I go into those?
You know, Mr. Fry and Mr. Schroyer, thank you both for your efforts. I certainly had a couple of things that surfaced as I read through your questions and responses. So I'm kind of working off of that sheet. I do realize that I'm looking at the sheet that has Mr. Fry's questions, number 5. He's talking about 4C, indicating the designation for the public depositories to receive at least funds at least every 5 years. I am just looking for a little clarification on that. I don't remember that discussion before, and you did have a current agreement in place. I don't even remember what bank that was with, that expires in December 31st, 2024. So is there only one bank that we have that kind of an agreement with? And who is the proper person to sign it? I mean, Toby, certainly your signature is on it. And is that what we would expect normally and what would be, I don't recall it coming to council. That doesn't mean it didn't. And just a little clarification on that, please.
I have been signing it since I've been here. The bank has accepted that, obviously, but I don't know if this is a more of a legal counsel question, Leslie. Does somebody else need to sign it?
Sorry. I don't believe so. Ever since I've been around, this has been handled administratively. I don't know if the mayor has any further input, but we've never done any legislation authorizing the signature to any for the just general banking decisions that I recall.
Within the last couple of years, we negotiated with Fifth.
Frozen again.
We had other banks turn in proposals to us, to see what their fees would be, and Fifth Third Bank did lower their fees. Toby, maybe you could give a refreshment on that, and that's why we're where we're at.
Yeah, the Fifth Third is going back to Mrs. Westfall's question. Fifth Third is the only company that we have that has our depository accounts, like our checking account and that. We have other investment companies that we get collateral statements from to improve the funds that we have them. A lot of them are in CD, so they're the $250,000 federal government insurance. But we periodically talk with Fifth Third, and we've been with Fifth Third for well before my time. But we periodically talk to them about the rates and what we can do to lower the rates. And most of the time, we do get some kind of a better discount or deal. But essentially, we're at the point now where all the banks would be about the same. And the majority of our fee is for our income tax department. It's a lockbox service. Not all banks provide that service, but some do. But most of them do not. But other companies do provide it. So our fees, that basically makes up the majority of our fees. And basically, that goes back to years ago when it was decided to have the bank do that instead of hiring another person and the income tax department to do it, because they're actually scanning through every check. They're doing a lot of that work that a person would have to do in the income tax department. So that's the majority of the fee, and that's gonna be similar no matter if you hire an outside company or if a different bank was to do it, if they even offered it.
Years ago, we were told possibly by Fifth Third, but by other competing banks, that they were happy to do it as long as our tax deposits by our citizens could be sent to Toledo or Cleveland or Cincinnati. And I made the choice at the time that I didn't like that they should come to a Sylvania address. And that's how we got into this lockbox address and why people don't send their checks out of town. They send them here to Sylvania. And we have worked to maintain that P.O. box separate from coming into our income tax office and us processing them ourselves. Fifth Third is able to provide that service.
So does that mean that when this comes due again, when it expires, that you do an assessment of whether this is still the best place to be doing the depositories at that time, or do you kind of just roll it over?
It can happen. You always want to get the depository agreement, but it can happen at any time where you, even if we had a depository agreement, we could change banks 2 years into that 5-year depository agreement. That's the depository agreement is really just to protect us, but it's not a binding agreement that we can't go to another bank.
Okay.
We typically get challenged by another bank that's providing local services saying, hey, give us a chance. We have an office in Sylvania, or we can service it. And that was the last time we ran through this, Toby. It might have been Metamora, I'm not sure, but somebody wanted our accounts and we gave them a chance at it.
Yeah, it was. I don't think it was Metamora. It was one of the new banks that was just opening a branch for the first time, but I can't recall which one it was.
Okay.
But that we opened it up then. It wasn't at the end of a service agreement. It was, hey, tell us we want to do business too. So we let them give us a proposal.
And if I remember correctly, that bank did not provide the lockbox service.
So,
and when the lockbox service was put into place, the income tax department was 5 employees, and so they had 5 employees plus they had a bank doing a lockbox service. We now have 4 employees, and that's at a permanent level. We're not in the process of you considering another employee. They're at 4 employees. So if we did want to take that lockbox service back from the bank, it would probably necessitate, having another employee. And it made financial, it's cheaper to have the bank do it than to hire another employee.
So Toby, what I think I'm hearing is, while we signed a 5-year deal for them to be the depository, we don't have any obligation that we have to stay with them. That's what I'm hearing, correct?
Correct.
You'd mentioned the lockbox and the income tax piece. When I looked through the budget, because I was curious about this document, the same as Mrs. Westfall, it looked like we were spending somewhere in the order of $50,000-$60,000 a year on banking fees. Is that the income tax piece, or is that, when checks get deposited because somebody writes a water bill payment, and somebody gives a $25 check for grass bags? Is that what that's what those fees are for? Is that a fair assessment?
I believe it's everything. Sharon, you might be able to answer that better, but they're because you see the fees from the bank every month, but it's the lockbox, everything is included in that, right?
You're on mute, Sharon. There you go.
It is, and we distribute that between court and tax and water and sewer and the general fund. So it gets dispersed out to 5 different funds each month.
Okay.
And like I said, the majority of that is the lockbox.
The majority of the actual overall expense of the fees.
Correct.
Okay. And when we look at like the Sylvania, the Metamora State Bank, would they even qualify? I mean, I don't know how large they are, but obviously they're not Fifth Third size-wise. Would they even qualify for something like this? I don't know that they have. Because this looks like that's a state level of certification, isn't it?
Are you referring to just the banking stuff or the lockbox?
The lockbox. Well, the banking stuff in general.
I think Metamora can handle the banking information. I believe they're the ones that we checked, and they do not do the lockbox.
Okay.
Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure that's the case.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions about that?
Thank you very much.
If I may, Mark, I do have a memory that we got a political message that we had to consider a particular bank that was forming, and I think it might be the one on McCord Road south of Sylvania Avenue, but I'm not sure that's the one. And it was a pretty threatening message, so I don't want to say it's for sure for them because I'm not positive. But they said, we're in the community and you've got to use us for your banking services. And we ended up talking to them about annexing into the city, and they refused to do that, but they didn't want to back away from the fact that they should provide our city services. They did get me going, and we got some rollback in the fees from Fifth Third, so it all worked out well.
Right.
We got an aggressive message from somebody saying that we had to use them, and they weren't even in town. They didn't even have a branch in town.
Right. Right. The only other item I had on my questions was the one question I asked you about indirect cost accounting, and you'd indicated, Mr. Schroyer, that you were going to talk to Mr. Aller about this. I'm just trying to get some clarity on, is that something we even need to keep in the policy if we're not doing it, or are we doing it? It's unclear to me whether we're doing it. I guess that's the first question. Are we or aren't we?
Kevin did respond. I think I got to talk to him further, but he did respond in an email. And he says he can remember looking at the salaries in the service department a few years back to see about the fund split, like as far as how much gets taken out of every fund, and that's all he can remember that could relate to that section.
Okay.
But I haven't had a chance to talk to him in person, but he says that's all he can remember of them doing. And quite honestly, we do that every so often, where we look at how we're distributing people's pay, especially in regards to the water and sewer, funds.
So That's what when it talks about indirect cost accounting, that's not utilities. That's because I know you split the utilities. I see that in the budget. That's something that's plain as day in the budget numbers. So this is somebody like Mr. Aller, who carries, I don't know, 4 or 5 hats at this point, something like that, and his time and his expense of his salary and bennies would get allocated amongst the various the buckets where he serves. Correct.
That's what we've done. We've done all the office employee, Mr. Shaw, Mr. Aller. We do look at that periodically and sometimes adjust it, sometimes don't adjust it.
Okay. There was one other thing in regards to the bond counsel, the financial advisor question, where you talked about using Sylvania and Associates and Squire Patton Boggs. Is that I think that's an annual retainer, isn't it? At least for Sylvania, or is it just as needed?
As needed. We don't have any retainers with any of those 2 organizations.
Okay. Good
and
enough.
Mr. Santo is the one that assisted in developing this finance and debt policy back in 2008.
Great. And from an income tax perspective, if we were going, as we discussed a little bit ago, we were going to wait. What's that time frame? Is that mid-May? Are we talking early June for the next to get a good sense of what we're actually experiencing?
As long as they keep the tax date the same, it probably makes sense to go to the end of June. You'd have half a year in, or we could go end of May. It really wouldn't matter which one.
Okay.
We would want to get all of May in, though.
Right. Okay. I'll put a tickler for me to bring that back up once we get to that time frame.
Okay.
That time of year. So, okay. Anything else from any other members of council?
Toby, when we do those transfers from the general fund to the capital fund, we generally do those at year end, right?
Yes. Yes.
There's no reason why we couldn't accelerate that if we wanted to change our balance sheet.
It depends where your general fund balance is, because you're going to take a 1.3 million out of your general fund balance. But yeah, you could.
You could do
whatever you wanted.
Yeah, or we could do partial. We could do it.
Correct.
We could do it at the beginning of the construction season, and then do one at the end of the year to clean it up.
Correct.
Particularly if you're concerned about the budget not reflecting the proper, the actual financial situation of the city. Okay, if you wanted to project a more accurate picture, we could transfer money into the capital fund earlier. That's one thing. The only other question I really had was on the financial planning elements, and I think Mark asked a question about this too. The 5-year financial plan, I think at one point it was sort of a rolling sort of document. Are we producing something like that? I don't seem to.
Yeah, that's something I sent out that was attached to my responses. I have a 5-year plan, but right now it just goes through the end of 2024. So I just have to update it for the last year. But it's just.
I know it's got to be a pain to do.
And then Kevin has a 5-year capital plan that he always presents to you at the budget time.
Right.
So
it would be, when we're looking at all that stuff, it'd be nice if we could look at it all together.
Okay.
Just going forward.
Any other members? I did have one last thing. Any other members of council before I bring up this one last item?
I would just ask that Toby maybe take a look back at the document he attached. I wonder if maybe he attached the wrong document because the first tab was correct, but the rest of the tabs were not. So you might take a look at that. I think you maybe just connected the wrong one to the email you sent out to us.
I had responded to Mr. Fry on that. I interpreted it to mean that it was just the main operating fund, which was the general fund.
Oh,
But I'm certainly, a lot of those other ones are special revenue funds that the policy didn't say to have that. But if that's something that council wishes, we could change that in the policy also.
okay. Well, thanks for that clarification. And I think that can be a decision that the Finance Committee can ponder. I'm not sure that it's important. It just was confusing to me as I went through the tabs. I thought maybe you'd attached the wrong document.
Yeah, I guess the issue is, a red flagging problem. If we're going to have a problem in the sewer department, that's a good thing to know too.
Okay.
But I understand that adds a layer of complexity to this process. And if it's not feasible to do that, I understand that too. But I think it is important that because the general fund includes transfers to those other funds. So you got to think about them to some extent anyway. But I think it's good for council to be looking down the road. I mean, we've been, as a city, compared to most, we've been relatively fortunate in that our finances are in pretty good shape, and that's a testament to you, Toby, and to you, Mr. Mayor. I mean, you have done a good job at this, and we've stayed focused in our spending. As an old dog here who's looking forward, I want to make sure that the next guy in this seat is able to look 5 years down the road and know what's coming. And I think that's a really valuable process.
Okay.
The one last item I had was that there was some lack of clarity on the cash balance transfers. And I suggested some language, and I don't care what the language actually says, but when I read the language for interfund transfers, it required council approval, but it didn't require prior council approval. And that's one of the things that I would like to get clarified. Anything that was approved in the budget. So if there was a transfer from like the income tax fund, Mr. Schroyer, that was approved in the budget or in one of these prior plans, I've got no issue with those.
Okay.
Certainly, those to me are approved because that's something we've done in the past. The same as the $1.3 million this year, that transfer is approved as far as I'm concerned because we approved the budget. But getting prior approval for anything beyond that, and if that's too, because of the types of transfers that we're looking at, I know we traditionally have done this at the end of the year. If that's too much of a problem because of something that would come up, we could certainly look at it, put a dollar limit on it, but anything above a certain level, certainly we would want council approval on that from my perspective.
I'm good with that. And it most generally, timing will never create a problem with that. We'll always be able to wait till the end of the year adjustment ordinance.
Okay. Anything else to come before the Finance Committee from any members of council?
Wait, I'm just a little confused there for a second. You always wait till the end of the year adjustment ordinance. Does that mean if there's an exception to the budget, it'll just appear in the adjustment ordinance? And if it's a wide variance, there won't be any attention called to city council about that. It would just be kind of folded into the mix.
It will be on the adjustment ordinance, and it'll specify what it is. But we could do further. Are you asking, should we do further discussion on it?
I guess I'm just pondering that. I don't have any specific thoughts on it, but something to ponder.
Yeah, I could certainly do a summary, especially highlighting something. The one that I did last year, I don't think I'll ever do another one of those. It was just a one-time thing. And that's the only one that we've done basically that was outside of the original budget. So I don't think it'll ever come up, but if it does and it's on that end of the year or adjustment ordinance, I'll certainly send out a summary and a description of what we're doing.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Mr. Schreier, and I understand that I'm concerned about the language, the way it's written now. All it requires is affirmative vote of council. It doesn't require prior affirmative vote of council.
Yeah, when we make these other changes, let's take that up and make that change too.
I like that.
Okay. Anything, again, I think this is the third time I said it, so I apologize. Anything else to come before?
Do we have a different, is it a different Zoom link?
Yes.
It is, isn't it?
Yep.
Okay.
So we got to go through the song and dance again, Doug.
Okay, that's fine. It's not a problem. I just,
Great. I'd entertain a motion to adjourn the Finance Committee meeting.
So moved.
second.
Moved and seconded. Any further discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Motion carried. We are adjourned at 7:27 p.m. and I'll see you all again in a couple minutes.
Thank you.